Hey there, it's Jason Stein, host of Cars and Culture with Jason Stein on SiriusXM, as well as on this YouTube channel. We interview everybody, actors, athletes, musicians, business leaders. We talk to the people who lust for the vehicle and the people who make them. So like and subscribe. Let us know what you think right here on Cars and Culture.
So I kind of really cut my teeth on how cars go together when I was a teenager. And then, of course, yeah, I started collecting cars when I was probably in my mid to late 20s. That's when my collection started.
What was the first one that you added to the collection beyond the Triumph?
It was an E-Type.
Okay.
And the story was I wanted to do something in engineering and something in restoration. So I ended up buying an E-Type to restore, but there was quite a long journey to get to the E-Type, because what I actually attempted to do was to buy, what I really wanted to do was to buy a Supermarine Spitfire, you know, the airplane, World War II British fighter plane. And a friend of mine, who's now my kind of workshop manager, a guy called Glenn, he had a passion for Spitfires as well. So I was like, okay, well, let's find one. Let's find a Spitfire to restore, and we'll just figure it out, and we'll start doing flying lessons, and we'll fly this thing. Turned out that was a bit too ambitious, because you don't just find unrestored Spitfires sitting in barns. And and even if you did, you have to have extremely specialized knowledge and engineering skills and certifications to be able to get one of these things airworthy at a huge expense. And then if you want to fly them,
find an E-Type.
Well, exactly. If you want to fly one of these planes, which are extraordinarily dangerous airplanes to fly, especially if you've just passed your flying test. So anyway, the whole thing didn't stack up, and I thought, okay, well, let's just kind of lower our ideas a little bit, and I ended up purchasing a Jaguar E-Type and needed restoration, and we were off with the whole journey.
Never thought of the Spitfire again, or are you still thinking?
Well, actually, I mean, if I really want to bore you with the story, before we got to the E-Type, I actually did buy a Tiger Moth. And tried to restore that, but again realized I didn't have the certain qualifications required to get an old airplane airworthy. So I actually did send that plane to someone else to restore, and they restored it, and it's flying, and I sold it, and it's flying, and it does kind of, you can go and take a ride in a Tiger Moth, in my Tiger Moth, which I had restored.
Amazing. Your interest in cars really fundamentally lies in the engineering, back to that again, and the concepts behind them. And all you have said that all of the cars that are in your collection have something significant beneath the surface. You love form following function. We're going to talk about Porsches in a minute, but form following function, and how that industrial design, and by the way, whether it's clothing or cars, is a mantra that you really follow at all times. Is that fair?
I think that's fair. What's special about cars, I think why I'm particularly drawn to cars, and particularly classic cars, is they encapsulate so many disciplines that I'm interested in. So I love engineering, so I'm interested in I love engines and gearboxes. I love the story and the development of engines and just the whole powertrain of a car. I also feel, especially with the cars that I like, which are predominantly European sports cars from the 1960s, I think broadly that describes what I like. They're like sculptures, so I can appreciate the form of the cars, on a sculptural level. But then, really when you're looking at those era of cars, the interiors, the leatherwork, the stitching, I mean, there's all these disciplines rolled into one object. And I'm fascinated by all of those different disciplines that have been put into this kind of singular, beautiful object.
And what is it about that era that draws you in?
I think I really believe cars back then have a certain shape, a certain fluidity, which can only come when you're drawing by hand. So modern day automotive design leaves me a little bit cold, and I fundamentally feel that it's due to the tools which designers use to create shapes and to create form. I think automotive, if you think about those CAD programs, you can make very complex things very quickly when you're running a CAD program, which you can't do when you're drawing something by hand. A Ferrari 275 GTB could only have ever been drawn by a hand and a pencil. And so I think it was the limitations that designers had in the 50s and 60s, combined with the huge cultural freedom and just sense of hope that swept across the world, post World War II, which allowed people to explore all of these wild ideas. So for me, there was just a kind of it was lots of things coming together in that era at the same time, which created something greater than the sum of its parts. I mean, I find mid-century design, whether it be cars or architecture or furniture, is just something that I don't have to think about. I just see it and I like it.
Yeah. Cars, by their very nature and the design of cars, are emblematic of the generation at that time, aren't they? And maybe it says something about where we are currently in the design of what we're seeing on the roads today. It's a spirit that you just described. There was a spirit of the 60s. There was a spirit of the products developed in the 60s. And now you see a return to that minimalist in form and function now, right?
I think so. I think we're seeing, I think we've got to a point where these, if we're talking about sports cars and these supercars and hypercars, they became something where so many fins and wings and bits of carbon fiber were added just for the sake of stylization. They don't necessarily have a function, but it's just to do something which looks good on a website or looks good on Instagram. And I think it's particularly interesting. We've got to a point now where I think people are starting to see through that. And I had an interesting conversation with Gordon Murray, who's creating some very interesting cars at the moment. And his whole mantra is about a return to beauty, to simplicity, and to a fluidity and a simplicity of shape that's going into the cars, and just removing anything which is just not needed. And that's something which I'd like to see happen more and more in automotive design.
You have such an interesting collection. I want to focus on just a few of them. Your Bugatti Veyron. It's certainly not a 1960s model, and it has one mode, which is fast. But you love the spirit of it, the design of it. Again, right? Is that what draws you?
That's an interesting one.
It's certainly rare.
What do I want to say about the Veyron? I think it's quite a pretty car. I think there is a simplicity to that car. And what I was really drawn to was just the scale of the brief that was given to that car by Ferdinand Piëch, and the fact that they delivered on it. I thought was a milestone in engineering. Honestly, I've sold the car because I didn't like driving it that much, actually. And
what was it you didn't like about it?
It was wildly powerful. The road noise was quite immense in the cabin because the tires were so wide. It was very difficult to maneuver. I live in the countryside and the lanes are quite narrow, and it's really it's a very big, wide car. but beyond the kind of engineering prowess which went into that car, and the engine's phenomenal, and the brief was phenomenal, and they delivered upon it, and it was a real game changer in terms of what people were doing with sports cars. I felt I was quite uncomfortable. I was always quite uncomfortable about about how heavy the car was. I do believe that cars are still too heavy. Sports cars are still too heavy. But honestly, the killer for me was the cost of ownership of that car. The servicing costs, the
Average
cost of
oil
the
change.
tires. I feel, I don't know the exact numbers, but I think the project cost for the Veyron ended up costing the company something like 5 million euros each to produce the car. And I think the sale price at the time was, like €1 million when they were new. So they lost so much money on that project.
Yeah, it was ambitious.
And I just don't understand how, on an annual basis, you have to pay so much money to keep the car on the road. And I have a sneaking suspicion it's some kind of scheme for them to try and get back some of the money they lost on the on the project. And honestly, I just feel like I don't want to. I didn't drive the car that much. It doesn't have a great use case, certainly for me. And I didn't enjoy how much money I was burning through just owning the car.
We interviewed Rob Dickinson on this show. I know you probably know him from Catherine Wheel. He is
I know him from Singer more than
exactly from Singer Vehicle Design. Yeah. Right. We interviewed him, and I asked him, of course, what Singer does with Porsches. And he said Porsche is the perfect vehicle to own from his perspective, because you can absolutely beat the hell out of it on the track and it'll come back for more, or you can take it touring through the English countryside and it's a great daily driver. You have 5 classic Porsches, I think, if not more. And your view on that brand?
I tend to agree. If you were to have one classic car, it would be a sensible choice, because for all those reasons, you can put it on a racetrack, you can drive it down a gravel rally track. They're pretty comfortable. You can get 4 people in them. They've got pretty good luggage space. They're quite reliable if you set them up properly. They look good. We're talking about the 911 here, I guess.
Yeah, the 911. Yes, yeah. Of course. Yep.
And yeah, I would say if you had to have one car, and if you were saying, okay, I'm interested in buying a classic car, but I only ever want to have one, and I want to keep it forever, and I want to do this, and this, then you would have to steer somebody to the 911. It would be a hard car to beat. I'd say it would be closely followed for me by the E-Type, which is also a very usable classic car. And this is my whole thing. My collection at some point was, I think, over 30 cars, and now it's down to probably half of that. And it might even get smaller, because I've got to the point where I don't just want to have these cars sitting in my garage, taking up space and not being used. So if there's anything in there now which isn't really getting used because I don't enjoy driving it, or it doesn't have a use case, then I'm probably thinking about moving it on, because I really do believe that we have to use these cars.
We grew up with that. We grew up with race car drivers as friends. Our family vacations were being stuffed in the back of a 911 and driving to Road Atlanta or Lime Rock or Mid Ohio. So that was just sort of the culture of our home. I remember vividly my father running in to the house after work and looking out the kitchen window to watch the cop cars going by as he evaded them from his, again, back in the day when you could do that. That was just how we grew up. And so driving, I learned to drive very young. I've always loved it.
You were 13.
Yeah. My father would take us, out to the church parking lot when it was snowing and pull up the e-brake to teach us how to drive in the snow. And so it just sort of part of the language of my youth, I would say.
And Kiki, your father had his own very interesting story. An ex-Marine and an NBC News cameraman in Southeast Asia, awarded the Medal of Freedom by President Kennedy after surviving 15 months as a prisoner in Laos.
Yeah.
It actually led to you wanting to make documentaries. That you pursued journalism at the University of Washington. You're the first journalist to ever create a world-renowned game and now TV series.
Well, admittedly, I started the broadcast. I had studied Chinese history. I started the broadcast journalism degree because I wanted to learn camera work and I wanted to learn how to edit. And it was all analog at the time. But yeah, I learned photography at a young age as well, because that was my father's background. You mentioned Steve McQueen earlier. The best man at my parents' wedding, they got married in his house. They had actually met
in Steve McQueen's house.
Yeah.
Wow.
They had actually met, I think, and I'll probably hack this story up a little bit, but they met at a gas station in like the desert, somewhere in Nevada or something, and they were both gassing up. Or I think Steve McQueen was working on sand pebbles, was shooting sand pebbles. So wherever they shot that, and they just started shooting the shit about cars, right? And I don't remember what my dad was driving, but there was something where they just sort of immediately connected. And I think they both had a very sort of adventurous and somewhat rebellious spirit. But it was cars that they connected on.
The rebellious spirit that carried down to you because you started taking the track on a regular basis. And in college, you started racing. You were about 24, 25 years old. You placed second in the Sports Car Club of America Club Racing. The following year, you won the Northwest Region ITS Championship. And you've maintained the Porsche Club things, the racing studios, things. Racing to you, what did that mean? Was it the competitive side of it that was the most attractive?
Ooh. I think there's a few things that were attractive. I think part of it, no question, I'm a competitive person. I love competition, right? Not just participating. I love the spirit of competition. I can pretty much watch anything compete. And if it's a good competition, I'm in. So that was definitely part of it. Another big part of it for me, though, is I love driving, but I'm so intrigued and drawn to activities that sort of require mastery, right? And not that mastery is ever something I will get to, but I love the pursuit of it. And so with the driving and the racing, it both was a very personal challenge. I ended up doing primarily endurance racing. My brother and I did some races as well together. With Motorola Cup and a few other series. And what I loved is it was such a physical and mental challenge. And on top of that, there's the skill of just the car control and understanding the car. And then on top of that is the competition, right? And I think that a lot of the mental tenacity required to be a good competitor or a top competitor. And so I think all of those things really made it something that I just loved. And then I will also say it requires such extreme focus that in some ways it's almost meditative for me, because I literally can only afford to think about that and what the car is doing, what I'm doing, and clearing my head of everything else is something that's really important to me.
It's a release for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. How much time do you get to race these days? How much time do you spend on the track?
Yeah, well, in a good, and because I'm in Seattle, so we don't have a year-long season. But in a good season, I get to get out there 8 to 10 times a year. I was in Budapest for most of last year, shooting season 1 of the show. So I got a few little forays out in Budapest, not at Hungaroring, but that's for a hopeful season 2. So yeah, so my poor car sat fallow this past summer, but we'll get back to it.
You once
Like
raced.
it's part of who I am, right? I took a break for a while because I was just so busy, and I just realized that I felt like there was something of myself missing.
Yeah, I want to go back to one of your more illustrious racing moments. 2002, you took part in a gumball rally race from New York to Los Angeles. Seated behind the wheel of an Xbox-styled Mini Cooper, you finished 12th ahead of many of your fellow drivers who were in Ferraris, Lamborghinis, and Porsches. It had to have been a very special moment for you.
Oh, it was so much fun. It was, funnily enough, my parents actually took part in the original Cannonball, the last one that was held in '79 with Brock Yates. So I grew up with that experience as well. Wow. But the gumball was great. And, what was fun about it is and it was when the Mini had first come out, right? So it sort of had that phenomena, like the new.
Hopefully you're enjoying Cars and Culture with Jason Stein. Like and subscribe to see more and enjoy the rest of this interview.
New Volkswagen Beetle did when it first came out. Like, people were just delighted at the sight of it. But it also
Get
had
enough of it, actually.
Yeah. And I was lucky enough that Mini got us the first one to come into the East Coast for this event. But really, like, maybe a tenth of the power of any other car in the field, but kind of a sleeper because, when you're out in the middle of nowhere and a cop has the choice between stopping a little silver box or stopping a red Ferrari, 10
we
out
know
of 10.
which car is going to go down.
Yes. So it was amazing because it turned out to be a very stealth choice. And aside from the fact that it took about 10 minutes to get up to speed, because it wasn't even an S, it was a pure Mini Cooper. So my rule was you just never get off the gas. I treated every gas stop like a pit stop.
To the floor.
Yeah, you just never stop because you don't want to take the time to get back up to speed again.
Well, and you mentioned the Beetle. I want to go back to just one other racing thing for a moment. Midtown Madness, 1999, the racing game that you were a part of. And that players started off with 5 new vehicles, and 5 more were unlockable. And those available vehicles, one of them was a Volkswagen New Beetle, as it's known. Oh, by the way, a Ford F-350, a city bus, a Freightliner Century truck. I love those racing games.
Yeah, I think there was something just about the freedom. Like, that was sort of a pillar of the game experience, right? It was all about just player freedom and that sense of exhilaration that comes from driving how you want, wherever you want, in a city that you recognize. I will tell you that we worked very late nights on that game, and the drive home for all of us when you're playing that game night and day is a little perilous. But yeah, it had just real enough physics, right, that you could suspend disbelief and really, again, get that personal sense of empowerment and freedom. It was a wacky game, but it was also, I still have people coming up to me about that game.
Streets of Chicago, is that where it was?
Yep, we had Chicago. We had a few different versions. I remember because back in that day, the way you mapped a city is you basically walked the streets and took pictures of all of the streets and storefronts, and it was about 105 degrees in the middle of Chicago summer when we were capturing photos for that.
Amazing. Women in video games. Are the doors open for women today in terms of video game design and the industry as a whole?
They are. I mean, the doors, they're more open. And I think I think a lot of the work that has gone into, and so much more work to do, but I think a lot of the work that's gone into trying to get more diversity and more women into gaming over the last 5 years has been, how do we make sure that we're finding women, that we're sourcing candidates, that women and girls understand that video games, and not just video games, but technology is a viable path. And I think that was sort of the thing, that getting the doors open was the first step. And I think the work that's really been happening over the last year or two is, how do we make sure we're creating an environment where women and diverse candidates can thrive, right? It's not just get them in the door, but what we found is we could get people in the door, but then we would lose them because it wasn't a culture and an environment that felt safe and inviting. And I think that's a lot of the focus of the industry now. Is it's not just about opening the door, it's about creating the home and the family and the safety for it to be a place to thrive.
Well, in fact, you've said that you believe that we have more females that play games than females who develop games.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of your missions to change that. So how do we change that?
Yeah, I think it's this virtuous cycle, right? Because the more people you have coming in and making games with diverse backgrounds, the more kind of content they're going to create that appeals, right, to a broader audience. And so it's I think part of it, and I see this positive trend already, is the democratization of both tools to make games and the ability to get your game out there means that we're actually seeing a lot more sort of indie games and smaller games that are able to take more risks on the kind of content that they focus on. And I think that has really helped for audiences to see that, wow, this is the kind of game I love and the kind of game I can make. For a while, it was always just these huge franchises and these huge blockbuster games that were getting all of the oxygen in the room. And now that's starting to be really different. So I think players are seeing themselves reflected far more in the games that are being made. And that, again, is that virtuous cycle of it becomes a viable career choice. And the more you have those game makers with diverse backgrounds, the more you're going to have games that represent it.
Pride does not come to mind when I think about the MC20. It is an endless amount of gratitude and a certain level of relief mixed with maybe satisfaction that we were able to deliver a product that I think is reviewed from people other than me or my team. People look at this objectively, viewed as something that very much fits the line of Maserati and is going to be a car that will be talked about long after I'm gone and my team are gone, and will appear in concours d'elegances and will go into collections. And this is something, Jason, I cannot stretch for you and your listeners or viewers on YouTube, this kind of responsibility, because you can imagine when someone says, well, first of all, you get a chance at leading Maserati design in itself as a responsibility. But then when first there's rumors and there's first conversations, and then suddenly it becomes official that we're going back to designing a super sports car, there is a moment of joy. But I guarantee you, Jason, it didn't last longer than maybe half a day, because then this weight on your shoulder weight comes in, because you're realizing this is not a car for a 3-year lease contract. This is a car, again, they're going to speak about in 50 years, maybe beyond that. And this responsibility still sends shivers down my spine. And when I see the all the love and the respect we're getting for the car, yes, there are awards, most beautiful cars in many, many countries. But more importantly, the love I get directly versus via social medias from the customers on Instagram, for example, that just means so much. But like I said, pride is not the word that comes to mind. It's really more of a relief. And I'm so happy for my team to have able to conquer this big mountain,
Klaus, I want to go back to something that you said a moment ago. You said you're designing a future collector's car if you're designing a Maserati. And you have said that in itself is a monstrosity of a responsibility on your shoulders. So I'm assuming you sleep at night, but you're probably left awake many nights too.
Yeah, Jason, it is, again, coming back to the power of the team. I am not a dictator, a design dictator. The reason I can actually most of the nights sleep well is simply because I sit down with my team and we harvest this energy and the knowledge of the team, because I was able to surround myself with incredible talented people in all my steps of my career. And I think that really made us strong as a team. And so what we do is, in the particular case of the MC20, I wouldn't say we talked more than we sketched, but there was a good balance towards that conversation that we had amongst us as a team, because any Maserati, but mostly with a car like the MC20, we had to solve in our head, what do we need to do to elevate the brand? Because this is more than just a car, it's a brand ambassador. And how can we do that? What is our right of existence? What is already happening in the supercar market? And there's plenty of product. And how can we be different? How can we be Maserati? How can we be Maserati even without a trident on the car? So there's a lot of debate and conversation that goes in there. And I hope my team would agree that my leadership style is very much about forcing them to give me their honest opinion about what they think we should do. Now, at the end of the day, it becomes my responsibility, together with other leaders at Maserati, to then digest this recommendation. But the outcome of this conversation then is that the car almost had designed itself in our heads. And we only have to basically put the pen to the paper and sketch it. Sounds a little bit easier than it was, obviously. But there's an important role in this kind of philosophical debate.
You've also said that there are visual things, the face that you see on the MC20 and other aspects that will foreshadow where Maserati goes in the future. And you also, and you said you did not want to design a car for Instagram. You didn't want to design a car that shouts, "Look at me," and is too aggressive, but you wanted to design that visual value, something that was made it a rolling sculpture to some extent. Have you recaptured what it means to be Maserati?
So I think there's 2 points I would say to that. Number one, why do I think visual longevity is such an important part? And it's not only because it'll go into a concours d'elegance in 30, 40 years, but if you look at where we are as a society and the role of a luxury brand, and we are a luxury brand, I think our obligation, and when I say our, I mean all luxury brands, the obligation is to deliver visual and qualitative longevity. Because I give you the opposite example. Luxury brands I do not have respect for are the ones that are commanding a high price, and they're probably delivering good quality in terms of product, but there's no visual longevity. In other words, if you look at some fashion brands, they force you to rebuy every 6 months. Now that for me, can be perceived as luxury because it's going to be expensive, et cetera, but it's not the role that we need to play in the level of being relevant and sustainable. Because I do believe that, if you allow me to speak about sustainability for a moment, because it's very close to my heart, and not only mine, but us as a brand and as Stellantis, is that to be sustainably relevant, you can do 2 things. You can continue to buy a high quantity of product and make sure it's either recycled or is recyclable, or you can buy less, but make sure that that one object that you buy has that longevity, qualitative and visual. And I think that's what we're doing with Maserati, with an MC20, or other Maseratis too. Point number one. Point number two I would like to make, coming back also to the rolling sculpture comment, is again, looking at society. Now, obviously, I've lived in many societies and understand there's a different approach and understanding of car culture. A big difference between USA and Germany, for example. In Germany, there's a very critical debate about cars in general, luxury cars, SUVs. And so now I can design a car that looks like, that shouts, "Look at me." I could add extra spoilers, extra air intakes, and a lot of edges and decorative elements. But is it the right move? Because do I really want to create this kind of attention that sometimes can be negative? Or do I create a car, and that's what we've done with an MC20, but also other products, that really only use the minimum required air intakes, that tries to avoid spoilers, that creates truly a rolling sculpture, and by doing that, adds visual value to the environment and hopefully is appreciated versus creating negative context. And the good news is, from all I can hear and all I see, is we have exactly accomplished that with the MC20, but also other products like the Glecale.
And you spent thousands of hours in the wind tunnel in order to ensure that the downforce on the MC20 was sufficient for the vehicle without adding a spoiler. This is the completely new format to some extent, especially for Maserati.
Yeah, you know what? It was very clear in the beginning that we wanted to try to work without a spoiler. Number one, it's visual noise. There's a space for a spoiler when you really go track and you do a track car, etc. But for a Grand Touring supercar, we wanted to remain as pure as possible. So we try to avoid the spoiler as an add-on piece. And secondary, if you do a moving spoiler, which we could have done to hide it while you're driving it, it adds weight and it compromises the space of your luggage compartment. So also that was not a good idea. So instead what we did, exactly what you did, what you say, is to be almost real-time designing the car with the aerodynamicists in Modena. Actually, wind tunnel, yes, but these days is actually all artificial. The computer does that for us until the final check in the physical wind tunnel. And so we did the car real time with aerodynamics, and that allowed us to design the car like a wing. If you, for example, I'll give you one interesting detail. If you look at the section of the wheel arches, normally they are very sculpted, they're peaking, they're round. On the MC20, they're not completely flat, but they're more flat than round. And so even the surface of the wheel arches creates downforce by being basically a wing surface.
When you think about the future and where the industry is going, it is undeniable that the electric vehicle movement is picking up speed, if you will. You drive, or at least you did drive, a Gran Cabrio with a naturally aspirated V8, and you love the sound of a morning cold start with a V8. Who doesn't, right? But you did something interesting as you started to examine how EVs would change design and change product development. You challenged yourselves with an interesting exercise. You took a video of a 1954 Pininfarina designed A6 GCS, you say the most beautiful Maserati ever put together, driving through the streets of Italy. You muted the engine sound and played classical music. And what came to mind when you did that?
Goosebumps. It was literally goosebumps. And it was this eureka moment of the future is going to be great. And mind you, this exercise I did exactly when I arrived at Maserati, because at that time, it was clear for us designers who live in the future that this will come. We didn't know at what speed and with exact every little consequence. But it wasn't done last year or 2 years ago. It was done 7 years ago. Because there was this challenge about what if, which we didn't know at that time, we would go electric. What if the engine sound would go away? Electric cars still produce some sound that you have to do for legal reasons. So we did this exercise. But you know what? The interesting thing was, while the video looked great with the original sound, I would argue it almost looked more emotional without the sound of the car, because suddenly you over amplify the visual impact of the car. I don't want to make advertisement, but there's a fantastic TV show where all characters, a few chosen, are blind. And I struggled first with the concept of the show, but once I got into it, the show did an excellent job of telling the world through the, well, I almost said through the eyes, but through the ears of someone who's only dependent on sound. And it was fascinating. And so we did it the other way around. We basically created something that now going forward will almost exclusively depend on visual. So what you need to do is you need to remind yourself then in the conversations with engineering and packaging, etc., we need to make sure that we maintain this aspect of rolling sculpture, which means we need to have amazing proportion, we need to have amazing design. And I would add, if you allow me, I would add one more anecdote to it. When we had the lockdowns, one of the many lockdowns here in Italy during the pandemic, streets became silent. And suddenly, when you would hear a high horsepower car, like for example, my Grand Cabrio, which I still own and will always own, announcing itself from 5 minutes away, I started to ask myself, is this something that will be accepted beyond car fanatics? And I'm not so sure it will be, to be honest. And I think you will earn much more respect if you almost enter the scene silently. So I'm absolutely optimistic about that aspect.
Wow, that's an interesting perspective, one that I have not heard. The sound of the internal combustion engine may be ostracized to some extent.
You know what? I love that cold start. I do. It's for me. My car is a reward. I'm not driving it on a daily basis. I usually drive it over the weekend. I will do so again this weekend. And yes, when I go into my garage and I start that car, it's more than just starting a car. It's like, yes, now the special part of the weekend will start, and I'm going to go to the mountains or to the sea or any of the beautiful places around Torino. So it's really a hedonistic, rewarding part of driving the car. But I also admit, if I drive the car on a long distance, just 2 weeks ago, we were driving the car down to Saint-Tropez. We're driving some of the mountain passes of the Mediterranean Alps. And as you're by yourself and you're going through these amazing, beautiful natural roads, these curvy roads through nature, I were wishing at that moment that the car would be electric. And I could just appreciate the handling of the car, which is fascinating, and just enjoy being there, driving the convertible with the roof open, be there with the nature, driving an amazing car, which is stunning inside out, but even further mute the sound. So it already has crossed my mind that I would be one of the first customers, probably.
But one thing you are passionate about that I see is you follow Formula One racing quite closely. And I think you had a hand in the livery of the Alfa Romeo Formula One car, correct?
Yeah, so Formula One, there's two aspects to why I'm so passionate about it. Number one, yes, during my time as head of Alfa Romeo design, we were designing the liveries for the team. And when you do that, you get a really beautiful insight into the workings of a Formula One team, because you have, one of the seasons we actually had the car in the studio, of course, in a super secret locked location where we already taped up the livery for the next season. And it was just fascinating, and it was usually my last thing every day before I left the studio, going to that beautiful room, looking at this amazing machine of technology, because it's really inspiring. And I want to maybe also create the bridge to Maserati. If you work for a brand that is born in racing, that means you cannot be sentimental about your past, because you lose. There's not a single race car on the planet that will ever run a race that was designed by look at this beautiful race car we did 20 years ago or last season. The one thing you always have to do, and maybe that's, again, it's Italian design when we speak about the fact we always do the best we can in this moment. And I would also add, because of that, Maserati, I always see design almost secondary, because number one is the performance, is how the car handles and what it represents. But I would also do another shout out to the new ownership of Formula One. I think what they've done with social media, allowing us to live and laugh and share our stories about Formula One every single day with amazing footage and stories on Instagram, versus, when we grew up, it was Sunday every 2 weeks, and that was it. Maybe Monday morning newspaper, and then you had to wait another 2 weeks. Now Formula One is present every single day, and I think they're doing a fantastic job also with the TV show, what is it, Drive to Survive. Mm-hmm. which brought my son into Formula One, which I thought was a lost cause. I thought I was truly dead to that generation that was not interested in cars. And hats off to those guys for raising these emotions.
Hopefully you enjoyed this interview on Cars and Culture with Jason Stein. Like and subscribe. Come back and see more interviews with actors, athletes, musicians, business leaders. It's all right here on Cars and Culture.